Your parents aren't home?
I'm sure.
Land
Ooh.
on adults who try to meet teens.
I really like your show. But America, Primetime.
So you are playing a 13-year-old?
Predator has never earned recognition.
I don't understand what I'm doing here.
Copyright disclaimer under Section 107 of the Copyright Act 1976. Allowance is made for fair use for purposes such as criticism, comment, news reporting, scholarship, and research. Fair use is a use permitted by copyright statute that might otherwise be infringing. Nonprofit, educational, or personal use tips the balance in favor of fair use.
There are some movies that immediately grab your attention because of their action, huge stars, or massive visual effects. Then there are movies like Primetime, which are interesting for a completely different reason. The film takes a real and controversial chapter of television history and turns it into a tense crime drama centered around the man who became famous for exposing adults trying to meet teenagers online. At the center of the story is Chris Hansen, played here by Robert Pattinson, and from everything revealed so far, this isn't being presented as a simple biography. Instead, the movie appears to be interested in the darker side of television fame, the pressure behind the camera, and what happens when exposing criminals becomes entertainment for millions of people. The story is inspired by the real-world rise of Chris Hansen and the television investigations associated with To Catch a Predator. In the early 2000s, the concept became a huge part of American pop culture because it combined investigative journalism with hidden cameras, confrontations, and shocking real-life situations. But Primetime seems to look beyond the moments viewers remember from television. The movie is interested in how an investigative idea becomes a television phenomenon, how the people behind it deal with the pressure, and how quickly the line between journalism and entertainment can become difficult to recognize. Robert Pattinson takes on the central role, and that casting choice alone has created plenty of curiosity. Instead of playing another fictional character, Pattinson is portraying a recognizable real-life television personality, which means his performance has to capture not only the appearance but also the voice, mannerisms, confidence, and complicated public image associated with Hansen. The early footage suggests that Pattinson has gone much deeper into the transformation than audiences might expect. His voice, posture, and controlled way of speaking make the character feel very different from the versions of Pattinson we've seen in many of his previous films. But Robert Pattinson isn't carrying the movie alone. The supporting cast includes Merritt Wever, Skylar Gisondo, Matthew Marr, Bakeem Woodbine, Phoebe Bridgers, Anna Faris, Sean Bridgers, and several other performers. The movie is directed by Lance Oppenheimer, with John Singh credited as the writer. For Oppenheimer, this project is particularly interesting because it moves him from documentary filmmaking into narrative cinema. That background could explain why the movie appears to have such a grounded and observational feeling, rather than making everything look like a traditional Hollywood crime thriller. The film seems to focus heavily on people, conversations, television production, and the uncomfortable reality behind the spectacle. The central character is Chris Hansen. But the movie isn't simply about one television host walking into a room and confronting suspects. The bigger story is about the creation of a television machine. Once the investigations begin attracting attention, the stakes become much larger. Every confrontation can become a television moment. Every shocking discovery can increase audience interest. And every successful investigation can create pressure to produce something even bigger the next time. That creates a fascinating conflict for the main character. On one side, Hansen believes the work is exposing people who may pose a serious danger to minors. On the other side, television networks are always looking for ratings, attention, and memorable programming. The more successful the investigations become, the more valuable the program becomes. And when real human lives are being placed in front of cameras, the question becomes much more complicated. Where does responsible journalism and entertainment begin? This is where Primetime could become much more than a standard true crime movie. The subject matter itself is disturbing, but the movie appears to be using that subject to explore something broader. It asks what happens when a serious investigation becomes a cultural phenomenon. People at home may see the final confrontation on television and think they understand what happened. But behind that broadcast there are producers, journalists, camera operators, editors, network executives, legal teams, and countless other people making decisions about what the audience will eventually see. The trailer gives us some idea of how the movie intends to approach this world. Instead of showing Hansen as a flawless hero, the footage presents him as an ambitious journalist who realizes that his work could become something much bigger. There is excitement around the success of the investigations, but there is also an uncomfortable sense that the television industry quickly understands the commercial value of what Hansen is doing. And that may be one of the most important themes in the entire movie. Success changes everything. At first, the investigation can be seen as a serious piece of journalism. But once millions of people become interested, expectations change. The audience wants more. The network wants more. The people working on the program know that the next investigation has to be just as powerful, maybe even more shocking, than the previous one. That creates pressure, and pressure can change the way people behave. The movie also appears to explore Hansen's personal world. His professional life may be moving faster than ever, but the consequences of that success don't necessarily stay inside the studio. When someone becomes publicly associated with such controversial investigations, their identity can become inseparable from their work. The person disappears behind the television personality, and that can create problems that audiences never see. Merritt Wever is particularly important in the story because her character appears to be connected to the production side of Hansen's work. Her presence helps expand the story beyond Hansen himself and gives the audience another perspective on the machine being created around him. Instead of simply watching one journalist become famous, we get a sense that there are multiple people contributing to the success of the investigations. Skylar Gisondo also joins the cast, adding another interesting element to the ensemble. The film has brought together actors from very different backgrounds, and that gives the project an unusual combination of serious drama and strange, uncomfortable humor. Even though the subject matter is dark, the world of television itself can sometimes be absurd, especially when executives and journalists start treating extraordinary real-life events like regular programming. That contrast could become one of the film's strongest qualities. One moment can feel deeply serious because the investigation concerns real potential crimes. Then the next moment can shift toward ratings, television competition, or the excitement of producing a successful segment. That uncomfortable combination reflects the complicated world the movie is trying to portray. The trailer also makes it clear that Primetime isn't interested in turning every moment into an action sequence. The tension comes from conversations, anticipation, uncertainty, and the knowledge that something serious is about to happen. The audience already understands what kind of investigation is taking place, so the movie doesn't need explosions or traditional action scenes to create suspense. Instead, it can build tension simply by allowing viewers to wait for the confrontation. That approach makes sense for Lance Oppenheim's style. His documentary background gives the project a different identity from a typical studio thriller. The camera often feels like it is observing rather than simply presenting. Characters are allowed to sit in uncomfortable silence. Conversations can feel awkward, and the television environment itself becomes part of the atmosphere. Robert Pattinson's performance is probably going to be one of the biggest reasons people talk about this movie. His version of Hansen is not designed to feel like the Pattinson audiences know from superhero films, romantic dramas, or psychological thrillers. He has changed his voice and physical presence considerably, and the transformation gives the character an almost strange quality. That is important because Hansen is already familiar to many viewers, meaning Pattinson has to convince the audience that they are watching a person rather than an actor doing an impression. There is also a fascinating question surrounding the real Chris Hansen's relationship with the film. Because Primetime is inspired by real events, audiences naturally want to know how the real person feels about being portrayed on screen. Hansen has publicly expressed reservations about the project and has made it clear that he wasn't involved in its production in the way some people might assume. That adds another layer to the movie's release because viewers will inevitably compare the dramatized version with the real person and the real history behind it. And honestly, that may be exactly what makes Primetime so interesting. The film isn't arriving as a simple celebration of a famous television personality. It seems to be asking difficult questions about fame, journalism, morality, television culture, and the audience itself. Because while the people on screen are responsible for what they do, the audience also plays a role. Millions of people chose to watch these confrontations. Millions of people became fascinated by the format. And once something becomes popular, the entertainment industry has a powerful reason to keep producing it. That is the uncomfortable world Primetime appears to be entering. And the more successful Hansen becomes, the more complicated his story is likely to become. What starts as an investigation can turn into a television empire. The most interesting thing about Primetime is that the danger doesn't necessarily come from one obvious villain. Instead, the movie creates tension from a system where almost everyone believes they are doing something important, while the motivations behind their decisions slowly become more complicated. Hansen believes in his investigations. The production team believes the stories matter. The network sees enormous audience potential. and the viewers at home want to see what happens next. Every person has a reason, but when all those reasons come together, something much bigger is created. This is why the movie's setting is so important. Television studios are normally places associated with entertainment, bright lights, polished presenters, and carefully controlled images. But Primetime places a dark, investigative story inside that environment. The contrast is almost unsettling. Behind the professional lighting and television graphics are real people dealing with serious situations. The camera can make something feel clean and controlled, even when the reality behind it is anything but. The movie also appears to explore Hansen's ambition. Ambition itself isn't necessarily a bad thing. A journalist who wants to expose serious wrongdoing needs determination. But ambition becomes dangerous when success begins changing the objective. If the first investigation succeeds, the natural question becomes what comes next. If the audience loved one investigation, can the next one be bigger? If a story receives enormous attention, can another story produce the same reaction? Those questions create a cycle. And once you're inside that cycle, walking away may not be as easy as it sounds. The trailer gives us glimpses of Hansen becoming increasingly confident about what the show could become. There is a sense that he believes they have discovered something powerful enough to change television. The excitement is almost contagious. But underneath that excitement is another feeling, the understanding that the people creating the show may be entering territory they don't completely control. That makes the title, Primetime, especially fitting. Primetime television is traditionally where networks put their biggest programs because that's when the largest audiences are watching. The title isn't just referring to television. It represents status, popularity, influence, and the pressure to keep millions of people watching. Once Hansen's work reaches that level, his decisions no longer affect only the people inside an investigation. They affect a huge television audience and potentially the careers of everyone involved. The film's dramatic potential also comes from the fact that viewers already know this is based on real history. We know the television program became controversial. We know the investigations attracted enormous attention. And we know the story eventually became far more complicated than a simple television success story. That means the movie doesn't need to surprise us by inventing a completely unexpected villain. The suspense comes from watching the characters move toward consequences that the audience may already understand are coming. This is one of the strengths of telling a real story through cinema. The audience can experience events from a different perspective. We aren't simply reading headlines or watching old television clips. We're placed inside the emotional environment of the people who were making decisions at the time. Robert Pattinson's Hansen seems to be at the center of that experience. His performance appears to focus on a man who knows how to control a television moment. He understands presentation. He knows when to be calm, when to be serious, and when to make the person on the other side of the camera uncomfortable. But behind that controlled public personality, the movie seems interested in the person who has to deal with the consequences. After the cameras stop, that contrast could become one of Pattinson's most interesting performances. We also shouldn't overlook the fact that Primetime is coming from A24. The studio has become known for films that are willing to approach uncomfortable subjects from unusual angles. And this project fits naturally into that reputation. Instead of presenting a straightforward, inspirational story about investigative journalism, the movie appears to be looking at the complicated relationship between truth, entertainment, and public fascination. The cast makes that even more interesting. Merritt Wever brings a grounded, dramatic presence, while Skylar Gisondo adds another dimension to the production team. Matthew Marr and Bakeem Woodbine further expand the ensemble, while Phoebe Bridgers appears in a role that has attracted curiosity because this is a very different environment from her usual work as a musician. Anna Faris is also part of the cast, which adds another recognizable name to a movie that already has plenty of unusual casting choices. Even smaller appearances could become memorable because the film's world is built around television personalities, production staff, journalists, and people who operate behind the scenes. And then there's the trailer itself. The first teaser introduced the basic tone of the movie, but the full trailer gives a much clearer picture of what audiences can expect. It presents Pattinson's Hansen as a journalist who becomes increasingly convinced that the investigation could become something enormous. The footage moves between the investigative operation and the television world surrounding it, creating a constant contrast between serious crime, reporting, and the business of entertainment. One of the most memorable ideas from the trailer is the belief that the show could become bigger than one of television's biggest hits. That line tells us something important about Hansen's mindset. He isn't thinking about one successful report anymore. He's thinking about a phenomenon. And that's when the story becomes dangerous. Because when a journalist starts thinking like a television star, the relationship between the story and the storyteller can change. The audience begins recognizing the host as much as the investigation. The presenter becomes part of the brand. And eventually, people may tune in not only because they care about the subject, but because they want to see Hansen himself. That level of fame can be extremely powerful. But it can also become a trap. The movie's release is expected to bring even more attention to these questions. Primetime is scheduled for a theatrical release in September 2026, following its festival debut. That release strategy makes sense for a film like this because it gives critics and audiences a chance to discuss the movie before it reaches a much wider audience. And there is already another reason people will be watching closely. Robert Pattinson. Pattinson is one of those actors whose career has changed dramatically over the years. He started as a global star through Twilight, then deliberately moved toward darker, stranger, and more challenging projects. Playing Chris Hansen continues that pattern. Instead of choosing the obvious role of a traditional hero, he is portraying a real person whose public image is already complicated. That choice alone suggests that Pattinson sees something interesting in the character. Whether audiences agree with the film's interpretation is another question, because Primetime is not a documentary, and that distinction matters. The movie is inspired by real events, but a dramatized film naturally has to make choices about structure, characterization, timing, and perspective. Some moments may be compressed, some characters may be combined or changed, some conversations may be imagined for dramatic purposes, so viewers shouldn't necessarily treat every scene as a literal reconstruction of history. Instead, the movie should be viewed as a dramatic interpretation of a fascinating and controversial period in television. And perhaps the biggest question the film leaves us with is this: when the public demands a spectacle, who is responsible for creating it? Is it the journalist who investigates the story? Is it the network that broadcasts it? Is it the producers who package it? Or is it the audience that keeps watching? There may not be an easy answer. That's what makes Primetime potentially more interesting than a standard true crime biography. The movie seems to understand that the story isn't simply about catching people. It's about what happens when the act of catching people becomes entertainment. And when entertainment becomes one of the most powerful forces in modern media. For viewers who remember the original television phenomenon, the movie could feel like a disturbing trip back to a very specific era of television. For younger audiences who only know the story through clips and internet culture, it could provide a completely different perspective on how that phenomenon began. And for fans of Robert Pattinson, it offers something even more unusual, a performance where the challenge isn't just becoming another character, but becoming someone audiences already think they know, with its real-life inspiration, unusual cast, controversial subject, and psychological approach to investigative television. Primetime has the ingredients for a movie that could generate plenty of discussion after release, but the real test will come when audiences finally see the complete story, because the trailer can show the tension, the transformation, and the most intriguing moments. It can make us curious about Hansen's rise and the world surrounding him, but the full movie has to answer the difficult questions that the trailer only hints at. How much does success change a person? How far can journalism go before it becomes entertainment? And what happens when the audience becomes addicted to the very spectacle that journalists are creating? One of the biggest strengths of this story is that it doesn't need to invent a complicated fictional world to create tension. The real world surrounding Chris Hansen is already complicated enough. What makes the situation even more fascinating is the way television can transform something serious into a product that people consume every week. Once an investigation becomes a program, there are schedules, deadlines, ratings, promotions, advertisers, executives, and audiences to consider. Suddenly, the people working on the investigation are not operating in isolation anymore. Every decision has another consequence attached to it. For Hansen, that environment creates a very different kind of pressure. A normal journalist can finish a story and move on to the next assignment. But when your identity becomes connected to one particular type of investigation, expectations can become difficult to escape. People begin to expect the same kind of story from you again and again. The audience knows what they want to see, and the network knows what keeps them watching. That can create a situation where success becomes its own source of pressure. This is where the movie can explore Hansen's personality in a much deeper way. The public version of him is confident, controlled, and prepared. He walks into difficult situations knowing exactly what he wants to say. But confidence on television doesn't necessarily tell us what someone is feeling privately. The movie appears interested in that difference between the man the audience sees and the person who exists when the cameras aren't recording. That contrast gives Robert Pattinson a lot to work with. Instead of constantly making Hansen dramatic or emotional, the performance seems to rely heavily on restraint. A small change in expression or tone can communicate something that a long speech wouldn't. That's particularly effective for a character whose entire professional identity depends on staying composed in uncomfortable situations. The more successful the investigations become, the more Hansen's image grows. He isn't simply a reporter anymore. He becomes recognizable. His name becomes associated with a particular kind of television event. People know what is going to happen when he appears on screen, and that familiarity gives him power. But it also means that the investigation itself can start revolving around his presence. This creates an interesting question about celebrity. At what point does a journalist become part of the story? When viewers tune in specifically to watch the host is no longer invisible. The person delivering the investigation becomes a character in the public's mind. That can be useful because it builds trust and recognition, but it can also complicate the idea of objective reporting. The audience may begin following the personality as much as the facts. Primetime appears to understand that problem, and rather than giving audiences a simple answer, it lets the tension develop naturally. The production environment becomes increasingly important as well. Behind every television investigation is a team of people doing work that viewers never see. Cameras have to be positioned. Information has to be checked. People have to communicate. Producers have to make decisions. Editors eventually decide which moments belong in the final broadcast. Legal teams have to consider what can and cannot be shown. None of this is visible to the average viewer sitting at home. But all of those decisions influence the story. A television investigation isn't simply reality placed directly onto a screen. Reality passes through a production process before the audience sees it. That doesn't automatically make it dishonest, but it does mean that someone is always deciding what deserves attention and what can be left out. That idea could be one of the film's most important themes. The people behind Primetime seem to be asking viewers to think about how television creates reality. When millions of people watch the same confrontation, that moment becomes more than a private event. It becomes part of popular culture. Clips are shared. People discuss them. Memes are created. The personalities involved become recognizable. Eventually, the original investigation can almost disappear underneath the entertainment surrounding it. That's particularly relevant to the story of Hansen because his investigations became part of internet culture, as well as television history. Moments that were originally broadcast as investigative reports eventually became clips watched by people who weren't even alive when the original programs aired. The movie therefore has the opportunity to show how one television format can evolve into something much larger than its creators originally expected. But there is another side to that popularity. The people being investigated are not fictional characters. The victims and potential victims connected to these cases are real people. That means the emotional consequences are real as well. When a television audience watches an investigation, they may focus on the dramatic confrontation because that's the part designed to keep their attention. But the people directly connected to the situation have to live with what happens afterward. This is where the movie can become uncomfortable in a meaningful way. Instead of asking audiences to simply cheer for the television investigation, it can force them to think about the human cost of turning serious situations into entertainment. Even when the underlying goal is protection and exposure, the method can still raise difficult ethical questions, and these questions don't necessarily have simple answers. A journalist may believe that exposing dangerous behavior saves potential victims. A network may argue that broadcasting the investigation informs the public. Viewers may say they watch because they want criminals exposed. All of those arguments can exist at the same time. The conflict comes from what happens when commercial television becomes involved. Networks survive by attracting audiences. A successful program can generate enormous value. That means even a serious investigative format exists inside a business. The people making the program may care deeply about the subject, but they also have to deal with the reality that television is an industry. the movie's title becomes even more meaningful when you look at it from that perspective. Primetime represents the biggest audience, but it also represents the biggest pressure. When a program reaches that level, every episode matters. Every story matters. Every mistake can become a headline. For Hansen, reaching that level changes the scale of his career. The man who once worked as a journalist becomes a recognizable television personality. His work becomes something people expect to see. And once an audience has become emotionally invested in a television personality, the network has a reason to keep that personality at the center of the program. That can be both a blessing and a burden. The movie also gives us a chance to consider how television fame affects personal identity. When millions of people recognize you for one thing, it becomes difficult to separate yourself from that public image. People may think they know you because they have watched you for years, but what they know is actually a carefully constructed version of you that exists within a television environment. That gap between public identity and private reality is where a lot of the movie's drama can live. Hansen doesn't have to be presented as either a perfect hero or a complete villain. In fact, making him complicated is far more interesting. He can genuinely believe in the importance of his work while also enjoying the attention that comes with success. He can care about journalism while understanding the power of television. He can want to expose wrongdoing while becoming increasingly aware that the investigations themselves have entertainment value. Human beings are rarely as simple as the roles assigned to them. That's why this story works better as a character-driven drama than as a straightforward biography. The audience isn't just watching events happen. We're watching a person become increasingly connected to an industry that rewards attention. And the more attention he receives, the harder it becomes to determine where the journalist ends and the television personality begins. That tension is likely to continue building as the story moves forward. The investigations become bigger. The audience becomes larger. The pressure increases. And eventually, the success that Hansen worked so hard to achieve begins carrying its own consequences. Because in television, getting attention is only the beginning. The real challenge is surviving once everyone is watching. As the investigations continue to attract attention, the world around Hansen starts changing in ways that are difficult to ignore. What began as a journalistic operation is becoming a major television property, and that means more people now have an interest in what happens next. Producers want stronger material, executives want bigger numbers, and audiences want another shocking story. For Hansen, that creates a difficult situation because the success of the program is now tied directly to expectations. Every new investigation has to live up to everything that came before it. At first, that kind of pressure might feel like proof that the work is making an impact. If millions of people are watching, then surely the message is reaching more people. But popularity also changes the way people look at the investigation. The audience doesn't necessarily know how much work happens before the cameras arrive. They see the final confrontation, the dramatic moment, and the reaction afterward. What they don't see is the long process that made that moment possible. This difference between what happens behind the scenes and what viewers see on television becomes increasingly important. A successful television program depends on editing, pacing, presentation, and timing. Even when the events themselves are real, the way those events are presented can influence how an audience feels about them. A serious situation can be presented as frightening, shocking, emotional, or even strangely entertaining depending on how it is edited. That doesn't mean the investigation is fake. It means television has its own language, and Hansen understands that language better than most people around him. He knows how to speak to the camera. He knows how to build tension. He knows when to pause. He knows how to make an audience wait for the next moment. Those skills help make him successful, but they also make him part of the entertainment equation. This is where his relationship with the people working around him becomes important. A television show isn't created by one person, even when one person becomes its public face. The producers, researchers, camera operators, editors, and other members of the team all contribute to the final product. Their decisions can influence the direction of an investigation and the way the audience eventually understands it. Merritt Weaver's character becomes particularly interesting in this environment because she helps represent the people who exist somewhere between journalism and television production. Her perspective allows the story to move away from Hansen's personal experience and show how the people around him are affected by the growing success of the program. The more famous the show becomes, the harder it is for anyone involved to pretend that they are simply working on another assignment. The stakes are different now. There is money involved. There is reputation involved. There is network pressure. There is public attention. And perhaps most importantly, there is the fear of losing momentum. Once a television show becomes a hit, nobody wants to be responsible for the moment it starts declining. That can create an unhealthy obsession with the next big story. The audience may not notice this pressure because television makes everything look effortless. A polished broadcast can make an investigation appear as though everything happened exactly as planned. But behind that polished final product can be uncertainty, disagreement, and stress. Primetime appears to be interested in those moments. Instead of only showing us the dramatic confrontations, the film can spend time with the people preparing for them. We see the waiting, the planning, the conversations, and the uncertainty about what will happen once the investigation begins. That approach makes the eventual confrontations more effective, because the audience understands what went into creating them. There is also something psychologically interesting about waiting for a confrontation. The person being investigated doesn't necessarily know what is coming. Hansen and his team do. The audience knows something is about to happen. That creates a strange imbalance where everyone is waiting for the same moment but experiencing it differently. For Hansen, the confrontation is part of his job. For the production team, it is the moment everything has been building toward. For the audience, it is the payoff. And for the person being confronted, it can be life-changing. That difference in perspective is one of the reasons the story remains uncomfortable, even when the television format makes the scene seem familiar. The movie also has the opportunity to show how public reactions can affect the people involved. Once an investigation is broadcast, it no longer belongs only to the journalists. Viewers begin forming opinions. Newspapers and television programs discuss it. People talk about it online. The story can grow far beyond the original broadcast. Hansen's public image grows alongside that attention, but fame has a strange way of simplifying people. The public may see Hansen as one thing, the television host who confronts predators, but a real person is always more complicated than a television identity. He has personal relationships, private concerns, professional ambitions, fears, and mistakes that may never appear on screen. The more successful his television career becomes, the more difficult it may be to maintain that separation. This is another reason Robert Pattinson's casting is so interesting. Pattinson has spent much of his career dealing with the strange relationship between celebrity and identity. He knows what it means for millions of people to think they know you based on a public image. That makes him a particularly interesting actor to place inside a story about a man whose public identity becomes larger than his private one. His Hansen doesn't need to constantly explain what he is feeling. Sometimes the character's silence says enough. There is a sense that Hansen understands the power of the camera. He knows that once the camera is pointed at someone, their behavior changes. People become nervous. They try to control themselves. They become aware that millions of strangers could eventually see what happens, but the camera also changes the person holding it. That's an idea the movie can explore in subtle ways. When Hansen first begins using television to expose these investigations, the camera is a tool. As his career develops, the camera becomes part of his identity. He isn't simply someone who appears on television. He becomes someone whose life is increasingly connected to being watched, and that creates a strange contradiction. He spends his career exposing people who don't expect to be seen. While becoming more visible himself, the audience watches him watching others. That reversal is one of the most fascinating ideas surrounding the film. It also connects to the broader question of privacy. The investigations depend on revealing behavior that people believed was private. The television audience then gets to observe those revelations from the safety of their own homes. But where exactly is the boundary between public interest and public curiosity? The movie doesn't appear to offer an easy answer. Instead, it allows the audience to sit with the discomfort. That's important because a simple moral message would make the story much less interesting. If the movie only told us that Hansen was doing good work, there wouldn't be much conflict. If it told us that the entire operation was wrong, that would also be too simple. The real story exists somewhere in between. The investigations can serve an important purpose while still being shaped by the demands of entertainment. Hansen can genuinely care about protecting people while also becoming a celebrity. The network can benefit financially while still broadcasting information that matters. And audiences can enjoy watching the program while believing they are supporting a serious cause. All of these things can be true at once. That complexity is what gives Primetime its potential. As the story moves deeper into Hansen's rise, the pressure surrounding him continues to build. The program has become too successful to ignore, but success also means that every decision carries more weight. A mistake that might once have affected one journalist can now affect an entire television network. And once the public begins expecting a certain kind of spectacle, there is always a temptation to deliver something even bigger. That's where ambition becomes dangerous, because the next investigation isn't just another story anymore. It's the next episode. And when real lives become episodes, the people making the show have to decide how far they're willing to go to keep the audience watching. As the television operation grows, Hansen finds himself in a position where his professional success is becoming impossible to separate from the larger machine around him. What once required determination and patience now comes with an entirely different level of attention. People know his name, they recognize his face, and they understand what kind of stories he is associated with. That recognition gives him influence, but it also means that every move he makes can become part of the public conversation. The strange thing about becoming famous for investigative journalism is that the journalist eventually becomes part of the entertainment. The audience doesn't just watch the investigation anymore. They watch Hansen. They know his expressions, his delivery, and the way he approaches a confrontation. That familiarity can make viewers feel connected to him, but it can also create expectations that are difficult to satisfy. The television industry understands those expectations very well. Once a program becomes successful, there is always pressure to maintain that success. A network can be patient with a new show because nobody knows what it will become. But once the numbers start climbing, patience disappears. Success becomes something that has to be protected. Every episode matters. Every story is evaluated. Every decision can be discussed in terms of ratings. For Hansen and his team, that means the investigations are no longer happening in a quiet journalistic environment. They are happening under a spotlight. And the spotlight keeps getting brighter. The movie appears to use this pressure to explore how people behave when their careers suddenly become much bigger than they expected. Success can be exciting, especially when someone believes they are finally getting the attention their work deserves. But success can also create fear. What happens if the next story isn't as powerful? What happens if the audience loses interest? What happens if another program copies the idea? Those questions may not be spoken directly every time, but they hang over the story. Hansen's situation becomes even more complicated because his work deals with subjects that naturally attract strong public reactions. There is no shortage of people willing to watch an investigation involving potential predators. The subject itself creates curiosity, anger, fear, and sometimes even fascination. Television understands that emotional combination very well. That is part of the uncomfortable power of the format. The more emotionally intense a story becomes, the more likely people are to keep watching. But when the subject involves real crimes and real potential victims, turning that emotional intensity into entertainment raises ethical questions. This is where Primetime seems determined to keep its audience uncomfortable. Instead of simply celebrating the popularity of the investigations, the film asks us to consider what that popularity actually means. If millions of people watch because they want to see justice, that's one thing. But if millions watch because they are fascinated by the confrontation itself, then the situation becomes more complicated. And the people creating the program have to live with that difference. The production team may begin to notice how audiences respond to certain moments. Maybe viewers react more strongly to confrontations. Maybe certain stories receive more attention. Maybe social discussion focuses on one particular part of an episode. Once those patterns become visible, they can influence future decisions. This is how television evolves, not necessarily through one dramatic decision, but through hundreds of small decisions made in response to audience behavior. Hansen becomes part of that process whether he wants to or not. His success creates a recognizable formula. And formulas are powerful in television. They make a program easier to understand and easier to promote. Viewers know what they are going to get. The network knows what it is selling. But formulas can also become restrictive. If the audience expects Hansen to confront someone every time, what happens when the investigation doesn't produce that moment? If the audience expects a shocking reveal, what happens when reality is more complicated? And if the network expects ratings, What happens when journalism demands patience instead? These questions create a conflict between the needs of television and the responsibilities of investigative reporting. The movie's supporting characters become important because Hansen isn't making these decisions alone. Everyone around him has their own perspective. Some may see the growing popularity as an incredible opportunity. Others may be more cautious. Some may focus on the journalistic importance of the work, while others may think more about the television value. That creates natural disagreements, and disagreements are where the story becomes human. Nobody needs to be completely right or completely wrong. One person may have a valid ethical concern, while another may have a practical argument. Someone might believe that without ratings, the investigation won't continue. Someone else might argue that ratings shouldn't determine how serious stories are handled. Both sides can make sense. That is the kind of conflict that feels more realistic because real workplaces rarely operate through simple good versus evil arguments. The pressure also begins affecting Hansen personally. The more time he spends inside the investigation, the more his professional identity consumes him. He isn't simply working on a television show anymore. The show is becoming the thing people associate with him. That can be dangerous for anyone. When your career becomes your identity, failure doesn't feel like failure at work anymore. It feels personal. This may explain some of the intensity we see from Pattinson's performance. His Hansen often appears completely focused on the mission, but there are moments where that focus seems almost obsessive. He knows that the work matters, but he also understands what the work has done for his career. Those two motivations can exist together. He can believe in the investigation and still enjoy being successful. He can want justice and still enjoy being recognized. He can care about the audience while also feeling pressure from the audience. That's what makes the character more believable. The movie also seems interested in the people who aren't famous. The camera operators, researchers, assistants, producers, and other workers don't receive the same attention as Hansen, but without them the investigations couldn't happen. Their experiences remind us that television fame is usually built on the work of many people. That creates another layer of tension because those people also have something to lose. A controversial investigation can affect careers. A mistake can damage reputations. A legal problem can threaten a program. The people behind the scenes may have families and responsibilities that make them think differently about risk. Hansen may be willing to take a certain chance because he believes in the story. Someone else might see that same decision and think about everything that could go wrong. That difference creates friction. And as the operation becomes more successful, those disagreements can become harder to ignore. The audience may also begin noticing something else. The people inside the television world are becoming accustomed to situations that should never feel normal. When you work on investigations every day, the shocking can eventually become routine. A confrontation that would leave an ordinary viewer speechless may become another day at work for someone on the production team. That emotional adjustment is fascinating because it shows how people adapt to extreme environments. The film can use this to explore how repeated exposure changes people. Hansen has to remain calm because that is part of his role. His team has to stay focused because they have a job to complete. But underneath that professionalism are people dealing with difficult material. Again and again, the television audience doesn't see that emotional burden. They simply see the finished program. And that difference between production reality and television reality becomes more important with every investigation. By this point in the story, Hansen's success has created a machine that is difficult to stop. The audience wants more. The network wants more. The team has invested more. Hansen himself has built a career around it. Everyone has a reason to continue, but the bigger the machine becomes, the greater the possibility that something will eventually go wrong. And when you're dealing with real people, real investigations, and real consequences, one mistake can change everything. That is the shadow hanging over the story as Hansen moves forward. The question is no longer whether the show can become successful. It already has. The real question is how much that success will eventually cost. Question is how much that success will eventually cost. The deeper Hansen moves into the world he has helped create, the harder it becomes to separate the original purpose of the investigations from everything that has grown around them. What began with a straightforward goal now exists inside a much larger system of television, publicity, ratings, and public attention. Every person involved has become part of something That is moving faster than any one individual can completely control. That is where the story starts becoming even more personal. Hansen isn't simply dealing with the pressure of producing another successful investigation. He is dealing with the consequences of becoming the face of a phenomenon. People recognize him before they even know what story he is covering. His name carries expectations, and those expectations follow him everywhere. When someone becomes that closely associated with a particular type of work, even ordinary professional decisions can begin feeling like public events. The movie uses that growing fame to show how quickly a career can transform a person's life. Hansen has spent years building credibility as a journalist, but television gives him something different. It gives him visibility. Suddenly, the audience isn't only interested in the information he provides. They are interested in him. That distinction matters. A journalist can remain relatively anonymous while reporting important stories. A television personality cannot. The audience sees the face, hears the voice, learns the mannerisms, and gradually develops an opinion about the person delivering the story. Hansen becomes recognizable in a way that changes the nature of his career. The more recognizable he becomes, the more valuable he is to the network, and the more valuable he becomes, the more pressure there is to keep him at the center of the show. This creates a strange cycle. The investigation makes Hansen famous. Hansen's fame makes the investigation more popular, and that popularity makes the investigation more valuable. Each part feeds the next, but cycles like this don't continue forever without consequences. Eventually, someone has to question where the process is going. That's where the people around Hansen become increasingly important. Not everyone sees the success in the same way. For some, the growing audience proves that the work matters. If people are watching, they are paying attention to a serious problem. For others, the size of the audience creates concern because the investigation is beginning to look more like a television spectacle. Neither side is completely unreasonable. That is what makes the conflict interesting. The film doesn't have to turn these disagreements into dramatic shouting matches. Sometimes a quiet conversation can be more powerful. A producer questioning a decision, a colleague expressing concern, someone asking whether a certain moment really needs to be shown, someone else arguing that the audience deserves to know. These small disagreements reveal the larger ethical battle taking place behind the scenes. And Hansen is caught directly in the middle. He has to decide what matters more: the investigation itself, the television program, or the larger impact the program can have. Of course, the answer isn't simple because all three are connected. Without television, the investigations may not reach millions of people. Without compelling investigations, there may be no successful television program. And without an audience, the network may have no reason to keep funding the operation. That interconnected system is one of the film's strongest ideas. It also explains why the movie doesn't need to portray Hansen as someone who suddenly changes overnight. Real changes usually happen gradually. A person makes one compromise because it seems necessary. Then another compromise becomes easier because the first one already happened. Eventually, the person looks back and realizes that the original boundaries have moved. That is how professional pressure can affect people. At the beginning, Hansen may have a clear idea of what investigative journalism should be, but once television becomes involved, practical realities begin influencing those ideals. Deadlines appear, ratings matter, executives have opinions, audiences have expectations, competitors emerge, and suddenly, doing the right thing isn't always as straightforward as it seemed at the beginning. The movie also benefits from the fact that Hansen's work exists in a world where technology is changing rapidly. Online communication, hidden identities, and digital investigations are becoming increasingly important. The internet is creating new ways for people to connect, but it is also creating new dangers. That makes the story feel connected to a larger transformation in society. Television is no longer the only place where people discover controversial stories. Clips can spread online. Audiences can react instantly. A television broadcast can continue gaining attention long after the original episode ends. This means the impact of an investigation can become much larger than its original broadcast. Hansen's work becomes part of a new media environment where television and the internet begin influencing each other. Something happens on television, people discuss it online, and the online reaction creates even more attention for the television program. The cycle becomes stronger. For a network, that can look like success. For the people involved, It can feel overwhelming. And for the subjects of the investigations, it can be life-changing in ways that extend far beyond the original broadcast. The movie doesn't need to spend every moment explaining these consequences because the larger idea is already clear. Once something is broadcast to millions of people, you cannot completely control where it goes. That lack of control becomes increasingly important. Hansen can control what he says during an interview. The production team can control how an episode is edited. The network can control when it airs. But once viewers see it, the audience takes over. People interpret the story in different ways. Some viewers may see Hansen as a hero. Others may criticize the methods. Some may focus on the criminals being exposed. Others may focus on the ethics of the television production. And some may simply watch because they find the confrontations fascinating. That variety of reactions is part of what makes the story so culturally powerful. The movie also gives Robert Pattinson the opportunity to show Hansen reacting to this growing public attention. At first, recognition may feel like validation. After years of investigative work, having people understand the importance of what he is doing can feel rewarding. But fame is rarely passive. Once people know who you are, they begin forming expectations about who you should be. Hansen's public image becomes almost impossible to control. If he appears too emotional, people notice. If he appears too confident, people notice. If an investigation fails, people notice. If something goes wrong, his name becomes attached to it. That is the cost of becoming the face of the operation. The pressure can also affect the way Hansen views himself. When your work receives enormous public attention, it becomes easy to believe that you are uniquely important to the mission. That belief can motivate someone to keep pushing forward, but it can also make it harder to recognize personal limits. This is where ambition and responsibility begin colliding. Hansen wants the investigation to succeed. The team wants the investigation to succeed. The network wants the program to succeed. The audience wants the next big story. Everyone is moving in the same direction, but the fact that everyone wants success doesn't mean they agree about how to achieve it. That tension continues to build underneath the surface. The movie's atmosphere becomes increasingly uneasy because the audience knows that the success of the program cannot continue without eventually creating consequences. The bigger the investigations become, the more difficult it will be to protect everyone involved from the fallout. And Hansen is becoming more visible at exactly the moment when the risks are becoming greater. That creates an interesting contradiction. He has spent his career trying to bring hidden behavior into the light. Now his own life is being placed under a much brighter spotlight. The man who made a career out of exposing others is slowly becoming someone the public wants to examine as well. And once that happens, Hansen can no longer assume that controlling the story means controlling what people think about him, because the audience has started watching him just as closely as the investigations themselves. By this point, the pressure surrounding Hansen has reached a level where the success of the investigation can no longer be treated as something purely positive. Every victory brings more attention, and every new audience member creates another person with an opinion about what Hansen and his team are doing. The program has become powerful enough to influence public conversation, but with that power comes responsibility. And not everyone involved agrees on where that responsibility should begin or end. Hansen continues pushing forward because he believes the work has a purpose. He isn't interested in simply becoming another television personality. At least, that isn't how he sees himself. He believes the investigations can expose dangerous behavior and potentially protect people who may not be able to protect themselves. That belief gives him the confidence to keep going, even when the environment around him becomes increasingly complicated. But the audience can see something Hansen may not fully recognize. Yet, the television program has developed a life of its own. Once a show becomes successful, it becomes difficult to control the expectations surrounding it. The network begins thinking about the next broadcast before the current one has even finished. Producers start looking for stronger material. Viewers begin expecting another dramatic confrontation. Public interest creates its own momentum. And momentum is difficult to stop. Hansen is now working inside a system where every investigation has to satisfy two different goals. It needs to be journalistically meaningful, but it also needs to work as television. Those goals can overlap, but they aren't always identical. A journalist may want to spend hours explaining complicated details, because those details matter, a television producer may worry that viewers will lose interest. A journalist may want to wait until every piece of information is confirmed. A network may want the story as quickly as possible. Neither side necessarily believes it is doing something wrong. They're simply operating under different pressures. This creates some of the film's most interesting internal conflict. Instead of relying on a traditional villain, the story can create tension through competing priorities. The people around Hansen may genuinely support him while still questioning some of his decisions. They may believe in the investigation but disagree about the way it should be presented. They may want the show to succeed while worrying about what success is doing to everyone involved. These disagreements make the television environment feel much more realistic. The more successful Hansen becomes, the more people start depending on him. His name attracts viewers, his presence gives the program credibility, and his reputation becomes a valuable part of the network's identity. That means Hansen isn't just responsible for himself anymore. If something goes wrong, everyone feels it. This also explains why the movie's tone becomes increasingly tense even during relatively quiet moments. The audience knows that the characters are working under enormous pressure. A conversation about scheduling can feel important because we understand what is at stake. A disagreement between colleagues can reveal much more than the immediate issue. The film seems to understand that tension doesn't always need to come from action. Sometimes tension comes from waiting for an investigation to begin, waiting for someone to arrive, waiting to see whether the information is accurate. Waiting to see how the network will react. And perhaps most importantly, waiting to see what happens when everything finally goes public. That sense of anticipation is central to the story. The original investigations became famous partly because of that anticipation. Viewers knew they were watching something unfold in real time. Even though the program itself was carefully produced, the suspense came from not knowing exactly how the person being confronted would react. Primetime can recreate that feeling without turning every moment into a traditional thriller. The camera can stay close to Hansen. The room can become quiet. The conversation can slow down. And suddenly, the audience is waiting for one sentence to change everything. Robert Pattinson's restrained performance works particularly well in these moments. Hansen doesn't need to shout to control a situation. His calm delivery can be more intimidating than anger. That calmness also reflects the character's experience. He has done this before. He knows how to behave when the other person becomes nervous or defensive. But the movie is also interested in what happens when that confidence is challenged. Hansen's greatest strength is his ability to control the television moment. What happens when the moment begins controlling him? That question becomes more important as his public identity grows. The audience begins expecting Hansen to be the person who always knows what to do. But real life doesn't work that way. Investigations can go wrong. Information can be incomplete. People can react unpredictably. And sometimes the situation becomes more complicated than anyone expected. The television audience doesn't necessarily see those uncertainties. They see the final product. That's one of the most important differences between journalism and television entertainment. The final broadcast often looks cleaner than the process that produced it. The movie can use that contrast to show how much uncertainty exists behind the scenes. Researchers may discover new information at the last minute. Producers may debate whether something is safe to broadcast. Editors may have to decide which parts of an investigation are essential. Lawyers may raise concerns about what can be shown. Meanwhile, the clock keeps moving. Television doesn't wait forever. That pressure can influence decisions, and once decisions are made, they can be impossible to reverse. The story also becomes more complicated because Hansen's work attracts public fascination beyond the actual investigations. People begin talking about his personality. They discuss his appearance, his delivery, his methods, and his reputation. He becomes a cultural figure. This is where celebrity starts becoming unavoidable. A journalist can influence public opinion without becoming famous. Hansen's situation is different because the audience knows him personally, or at least believes they do. That creates a strange relationship. People feel like they know him because they watch him regularly, but Hansen doesn't know them. Millions of viewers are forming opinions about a person they have never met. That is the reality of television celebrity. And the more famous Hansen becomes, the more difficult it becomes for him to step outside that identity. the movie also gives us a broader look at how television networks think. For executives, a successful investigative program is valuable not only because it attracts viewers but because it gives the network an identity. It can create headlines, generate publicity, and establish the network as a place where important stories are being told. That gives Hansen's work another layer of importance. His success is no longer just about his own career. It becomes part of the network's brand, and once a person's work becomes connected to a company's identity, disagreements can become much more serious. An executive may not see an investigation the same way Hansen does. A producer may have concerns about a particular approach. A colleague may think the story needs more context. Hansen may believe that delaying the investigation could weaken its impact. Everyone has something at stake. This makes the story feel like a pressure cooker. Nothing has to explode immediately. The tension simply keeps building. At the same time, Hansen's personal life is becoming harder to protect from his professional identity. The more attention he receives, the more difficult it becomes to maintain normal relationships. When someone spends so much time surrounded by investigations, cameras, producers, and deadlines, it can become difficult to switch off. The character begins living in two worlds. There is the public Hansen, confident and controlled, and there is the private Hansen, who has to deal with everything that the cameras don't show. That contrast gives the story emotional weight. Because eventually, everyone has a limit. No matter how confident someone appears on television, constant pressure eventually takes a toll. The question is whether Hansen recognizes that limit before something forces him to, and as the investigation continues expanding, there are signs that the consequences of the program's success are becoming impossible to ignore. The people around Hansen can feel the change. The network can feel it. The audience may not realize it yet, but the story is moving toward a point where the television phenomenon can no longer exist without affecting the people who created it. Hansen wanted the world to pay attention. Now the world is paying attention to everything. And when millions of eyes are watching, even the smallest mistake can become impossible to hide. Even the smallest mistake can become impossible to hide. The more attention the program receives, the more Hansen begins to realize that being successful on television comes with a completely different set of problems. When you're an ordinary journalist, a mistake can sometimes be corrected quietly, but when millions of people know your name, even a small mistake can become a public event. Hansen has built his reputation on being the person who walks into difficult situations with confidence, but now the pressure is coming from every direction, and the people around him are beginning to understand just how much is at stake. What makes this stage of the story especially interesting is that Hansen isn't simply chasing another investigation. He is trying to protect the reputation of something that has become much larger than himself. The show has developed an identity, and that identity is closely connected to his own. Viewers expect a certain kind of experience every time they watch. They expect tension, confrontation, and a sense that Hansen is about to uncover something hidden. Meeting those expectations becomes part of his job. But real investigations don't follow television formulas. Sometimes the evidence isn't as clear as expected. Sometimes people behave differently from what the production team anticipated. Sometimes an investigation takes longer than planned. And sometimes the most important details are the ones that don't create dramatic television. That creates a problem. The reality of journalism is messy. While television prefers structure, there needs to be a beginning, a build-up, a climax, and a conclusion. The audience needs to understand what happened and why it matters. The network needs a program that keeps people watching. But reality doesn't always fit neatly into that structure. Hansen has to operate between these two worlds. He knows what television needs, but he also knows that the work itself has consequences. The decisions he makes aren't simply about making an episode interesting. They can affect real people, real investigations, and potentially real lives. That responsibility weighs heavily on the story. The production team also starts facing the challenge of maintaining trust. When audiences watch an investigative program, they assume the people behind the camera know what they're doing. They trust that the information has been checked and that the program isn't simply creating drama for the sake of entertainment. The more successful the show becomes, the more important that trust becomes. One mistake could damage everything. That's why the people around Hansen have to be extremely careful. A television program can spend years building credibility and lose it very quickly. The audience may forgive a weak episode, but a serious mistake can change the way people see the entire operation. Hansen understands that, But he also understands that hesitation can cost an opportunity. And that creates another conflict. If the team waits too long, they might lose the chance to expose someone. If they move too quickly, they might make a mistake. There is no perfect solution. This uncertainty makes the story feel much more realistic than a simple hero narrative. Hansen isn't operating in a world where every answer is obvious. He is constantly making decisions with incomplete information, knowing that whatever he chooses will have consequences. That's also where the supporting characters become more important. The people around Hansen are not just there to help move the story forward. They represent different ways of looking at the same situation. Some are more focused on the journalistic mission. Others understand the demands of television. Some may be impressed by Hansen's confidence, while others may begin wondering whether the growing fame is changing him. These different perspectives keep the story from becoming one-dimensional. One of the most fascinating changes is the way Hansen begins to understand his own power. At the beginning, he needs the television network to give him a platform. As the program becomes successful, the relationship starts changing. Hansen's presence itself becomes valuable. That gives him leverage. But power can change relationships. People who once treated Hansen like an ordinary journalist now have to consider his importance to the network. His opinions carry more weight. His decisions affect more people. And when someone's influence grows that quickly, it becomes difficult to know who is challenging them honestly and who is simply trying to stay on their good side. That can create an environment where bad decisions become easier, not because everyone suddenly becomes dishonest, but because people become afraid of challenging someone who is important to the success of the operation. The movie appears to be interested in that kind of quiet pressure. A person doesn't need to be surrounded by obvious enemies to become isolated. Sometimes isolation happens because everyone around you is telling you what you want to hear. For Hansen, that can become dangerous. He has spent so much time being the person who controls the confrontation that he may not be prepared for a situation where he loses control. And the more successful the show becomes, the more likely that situation becomes. The audience also becomes part of the pressure. Viewers may not think of themselves as influencing the production, but ratings tell the network what people want. If a particular kind of story receives enormous attention, that information doesn't disappear. It becomes part of the discussion about what the show should do next. This is how an audience can influence television without ever speaking directly to the people making it. Every view becomes a signal. Every rating becomes a signal. Every headline becomes a signal. And eventually, those signals can shape the direction of an entire program. Hansen is therefore working inside a feedback loop. He creates investigations that attract attention. The attention creates ratings. The ratings encourage the network to continue. The network's support allows more investigations to happen. Those investigations create even more attention. It sounds like the perfect formula. But perfect formulas rarely stay perfect. Eventually, the pressure to repeat success can become stronger than the original reason for creating the program. That's the danger the film keeps circling around. The show exists because the investigations matter, but the show also needs the investigations to remain successful. Those two things sound similar, but they aren't always the same. This distinction becomes particularly important when the audience starts expecting bigger and more shocking stories. A story that once seemed extraordinary can eventually feel ordinary simply because viewers have become accustomed to it. That's another problem with television. The audience adapts. What shocks people today may not shock them tomorrow. And when a program depends on emotional impact, that can create pressure to constantly increase the intensity. Hansen may not consciously want that. The network may not openly demand it, but the system naturally pushes in that direction. That is why Primetime feels like a story about much more than one journalist. It is about what happens when a serious mission enters an industry designed to attract attention. Television rewards visibility. Journalism often rewards patience. Television wants immediate impact. Investigations often require time. Television measures success through audiences. Journalism measures success through accuracy, public value, and accountability. When those worlds work together, they can create something powerful. But when they begin pulling in different directions, the people caught between them can face impossible choices. Hansen is increasingly becoming that person caught in the middle. He still believes in the mission. He still understands why the investigations matter. But now he also knows how much is riding on the success of the program. His career is connected to it. The network is connected to it. The people working with him are connected to it. And millions of viewers are connected to it emotionally. That means walking away is no longer a simple decision. Even if Hansen wanted to slow things down, there are people around him who might not want the momentum to stop. That is the real danger of success. Once enough people depend on something continuing, stopping becomes almost as difficult as starting. And as Hansen's television empire grows, the pressure to keep moving forward becomes stronger than ever. The cameras are still rolling. The audience is still watching. The network still wants another story. But behind the confidence and the success, something has begun to change. Hansen is no longer simply investigating a hidden world. He has created a public world of his own. And sooner or later, that world is going to demand a price. That world is going to demand a price. The price of success becomes harder to ignore as Hansen's professional world continues expanding. At this point, the television program is no longer just another project on his career. It has become the thing people associate with him most strongly, and that creates a strange kind of dependence. The more successful the program becomes, the more Hansen's future seems connected to keeping it alive. What once felt like an opportunity now starts feeling like a responsibility that he can't simply put down. The people around him can see that change as well. In the beginning, everyone could focus on the investigation itself. The goal was relatively simple: gather information, uncover dangerous behavior, and bring it into the open. But now there are meetings about ratings, publicity, production schedules, audience expectations, and the future of the program. The investigation is still at the center, but it is surrounded by an entire industry that has its own priorities, and those priorities can be difficult to ignore. A television network doesn't operate like a newsroom alone. It has shareholders, executives, advertisers, competitors, programming schedules, and a constant need to keep audiences engaged. Even a program built around serious journalism has to survive inside that environment. That means success is measured in more than journalistic impact. It is measured in attention. The more attention Hansen receives, the more valuable the program becomes. And the more valuable it becomes, the more pressure there is to protect it. That pressure can change the way people behave without anyone making an obvious decision to do something wrong. A producer might push for a stronger opening because the audience needs to stay engaged. An executive might ask whether the next story can have a bigger impact. Someone on the team might suggest changing the structure because viewers responded strongly to a particular moment. Each decision can seem reasonable by itself, but when all of those decisions happen repeatedly, they can slowly change the identity of a program. That is the transformation the movie appears to be exploring. The investigation starts as journalism, then it becomes television. Then television becomes a brand. And eventually, the brand begins influencing the journalism. That's a dangerous cycle because once a brand has been created, people naturally want to protect it. Hansen's image as the confident investigator becomes part of the audience's expectations. If he suddenly behaves differently, viewers may wonder what happened. If the show changes direction, people may stop watching. The pressure to remain familiar can be just as powerful as the pressure to become bigger. Hansen therefore finds himself trapped between two expectations. The audience wants the Hansen they already know. The television industry wants a version of Hansen that can continue attracting attention. And Hansen himself may want to believe that he is still the same journalist who started the investigations in the first place. Those identities don't always fit together perfectly. This is where Robert Pattinson's performance becomes especially important. Instead of playing Hansen as someone who is obviously falling apart, he gives the character a controlled exterior. The character remains composed because that is what he has learned to do. But the more pressure builds, the more small cracks begin appearing beneath that confidence. A pause lasts a little longer. A conversation becomes more uncomfortable. A decision takes more time. Those subtle changes can tell us that Hansen is beginning to understand the consequences of the world he has created, and that is more interesting than simply watching him become a different person overnight. People rarely change that way. They adapt. They justify. They compromise. They convince themselves that one difficult decision is necessary because the larger mission matters more. Then another decision becomes necessary. Eventually, the line they once considered important has moved. That psychological process can give Primetime much of its emotional weight. Hansen isn't necessarily losing his sense of purpose. He is struggling to protect it while operating inside a system that constantly rewards something else. The audience also has a role in this. Viewers may believe they are simply watching television, but their attention creates demand. Every time someone tunes in, the network receives another signal that the program matters. Every time people discuss an episode, the story receives more publicity. Every time a clip spreads online, more people become curious. The audience doesn't need to know the producers personally to influence the direction of the show. Their attention is enough. This is one of the most uncomfortable ideas in the story because it forces viewers to look at themselves. Why do people watch these investigations? Is it because they want to understand the issue? Is it because they want justice? Is it because they are fascinated by confrontation? Or is it simply because the format is compelling television? There may not be one answer. People can watch for all of those reasons at the same time. And the television industry knows that. That knowledge creates an unusual relationship between journalism and entertainment. Serious stories can attract audiences precisely because they contain elements of drama. But once audiences become accustomed to that drama, the program may have to work harder to maintain attention. The danger isn't necessarily intentional exploitation. Sometimes it happens simply because that's how the industry works. The next story has to compete with the previous story. The next episode has to compete with everything else on television. The next broadcast has to give people a reason not to change the channel. Hansen is now operating in that environment. The work still matters. But now the work also has to perform. That word changes everything. A television program can be successful or unsuccessful. It can gain an audience or lose one. It can generate headlines or disappear. And once journalists start thinking in those terms, the way they approach their work can change. The film appears to be interested in that tension without turning it into a simple accusation. Instead, it shows how reasonable decisions can create unreasonable consequences. One producer wants the story to be clear. One executive wants the story to be popular. One journalist wants the story to be accurate. One editor wants the story to move faster. One audience wants the story to be shocking. Everyone is doing their job. But when all of those goals collide, the final result can become something nobody originally intended. That is the central tension surrounding Hansen. The television program has become too successful to remain simple. There are now too many people involved, too much money. Too much attention. Too much reputation at stake. And too many expectations. Hansen's name has become part of all of it. That means even if he wants to protect the original purpose of the investigation, he can't completely control what the program has become. This is where the story begins moving toward a more personal conflict. Hansen has spent so much time exposing hidden behavior that he may not have noticed how much his own life has become exposed. The public sees his television personality, but the more famous he becomes, the more people become interested in the person behind it. His success becomes a subject of discussion. His methods become a subject of debate. His decisions become a subject of criticism. And eventually, the man behind the camera becomes just as interesting to the audience as the people he confronts. That reversal is incredibly important. The investigator is now being investigated by public opinion. Every appearance can be analyzed. Every decision can be questioned. Every mistake can become a story. And the more Hansen tries to maintain control, the more he realizes that public attention is something you can attract but never completely control. The program has given him a powerful platform, but that platform has also placed him under a microscope. The irony is difficult to miss. Hansen built his career by bringing hidden behavior into the light. Now his own career is being examined under that same light. And the closer the story gets to that point, the more the pressure becomes personal rather than professional. The question is no longer whether Hansen can keep the program successful. The question is whether he can survive the consequences of becoming the person everyone expects to keep it successful, because once a television personality becomes bigger than the show itself, every problem starts following the person home. And Hansen is getting closer and closer to discovering exactly what that means. Closer and closer to discovering exactly what that means. By this stage, Hansen's success has created a situation that is almost impossible to reverse. The television program has become part of his identity, and the audience has become accustomed to seeing him in control. But the more powerful his public image becomes, the more difficult it is for him to admit that he may not always have control behind the scenes. Everyone sees the confident television personality. Very few people see the pressure that comes with maintaining that image. That pressure begins affecting the way Hansen approaches his work. The investigations are still important to him, but now there is another layer attached to every decision. He knows the audience is waiting. He knows the network is watching. He knows his colleagues are depending on him. And he knows that one unsuccessful investigation could create questions about everything the program has built. This is what happens when success becomes an expectation. At first, success feels like a reward. Later, it becomes a requirement. Hansen is no longer simply trying to prove that his investigations can work. He is trying to prove that they can continue working at the same level. That difference may seem small, but psychologically, it changes everything. When you're trying to succeed, failure is something that might happen. When you're expected to succeed, failure becomes something you're afraid of. That fear can influence decisions. It can make people take risks they might not have taken before. It can make them ignore warning signs. And sometimes, it can make them believe that slowing down is more dangerous than continuing. The movie appears to use this pressure to show a different side of Hansen. The public sees confidence, but underneath that confidence is a man who has become deeply invested in proving that his work matters. The investigations aren't simply a job anymore. They are evidence of his own value. That's why criticism can become so personal. If someone questions the show, Hansen may hear a question about himself. If someone questions his methods, it may feel like a challenge to his credibility. If an investigation fails, it may feel like a failure of his entire career. That is the danger of attaching personal identity to professional success. The supporting characters become even more important here because they can see things Hansen may not. Someone outside the center of the operation can recognize when the pressure is becoming unhealthy. A colleague might notice that Hansen is working too much. A producer might realize that the team is taking unnecessary risks. Another person might simply ask whether the program is still serving the purpose it was created for. Those questions don't necessarily mean they are against Hansen. Sometimes the people who challenge you are the ones trying to protect you. But when someone is deeply committed to a mission, criticism can feel like betrayal. That's another layer of conflict the film can explore. Hansen has built his reputation around certainty. He is the person who enters the room knowing what he is looking for. But the reality behind the investigation is full of uncertainty. Information can be incomplete. People can behave unpredictably. Technology can create unexpected problems. Legal and ethical questions can appear at any moment. The television audience doesn't necessarily see those complications. They see a man who appears to know exactly what he is doing. Maintaining that image becomes another job. And Hansen is already carrying enough responsibilities. The production itself requires constant attention. There are meetings, research sessions, interviews, technical preparations, security concerns, and decisions about how the final program should be presented. The operation is much larger than the audience realizes. This is one reason the film's behind-the-scenes perspective is so valuable. It reminds us that television doesn't simply happen. Every moment viewers remember has dozens of invisible decisions behind it. The camera angle, the timing, the edit, the music, the wording, the order of events, the reaction shot. All of these choices can shape how the audience understands a situation. And once a program becomes famous, those choices become increasingly important. The people making them know that they aren't just producing another piece of television. They are shaping public perception. That responsibility can be difficult to carry. Hansen's team has to decide how much of the investigation should be shown and how much should remain private. They have to consider what serves the public interest and what simply creates spectacle. They have to think about whether a dramatic moment is necessary to explain the story or whether it is being included because it will attract attention. These questions don't have easy answers. That's why Primetime has the potential to work as a character drama rather than simply a crime story. The crime itself is only one part of the narrative. The bigger story is about what happens when people build an entire entertainment system around real investigations. And that system changes everyone inside it. Hansen becomes more famous. The production team becomes more experienced. The network becomes more invested. The audience becomes more demanding. And the investigations become more valuable. Everything grows together. But growth creates instability. The larger the system becomes, the more difficult it is to keep every part working perfectly. One mistake can affect everyone. One disagreement can become a serious conflict. One investigation can produce consequences nobody expected. The movie's tension therefore comes not only from what Hansen is investigating, but from what is happening to the people conducting the investigation. That distinction becomes clearer as the story progresses. The audience begins to understand that Hansen's greatest challenge may not be confronting the people on the other side of the camera. His greatest challenge may be dealing with the people on his own side, because everyone around him has a different idea of what success looks like. For Hansen, success may mean exposing wrongdoing. For the network, success may mean ratings. For producers, success may mean creating a compelling program. For viewers, success may mean seeing justice happen. For the people being investigated, success may mean avoiding exposure altogether. Those goals cannot all be satisfied. Eventually, someone loses. That is what gives the story its underlying sense of danger. The program can look successful from the outside while becoming increasingly unstable on the inside. And this is where Hansen's relationship with fame becomes even more complicated. The public attention that once gave him credibility now creates expectations that are almost impossible to escape. He has become a recognizable figure, and recognizable figures don't get to make mistakes quietly. Everything becomes part of the image. The way he speaks, the way he reacts, the stories he chooses, the people he confronts, the network decisions he supports. The public begins creating a version of Hansen that may not completely match the real person, and eventually, Hansen has to live with that version of himself. The irony is that the more successful he becomes at controlling television moments, the less control he has over his own public identity. The audience decides who they think he is. The media decides which parts of his story are worth discussing. The network decides how to market him. And Hansen has to exist somewhere inside all of that. That can be exhausting. It also makes the idea of privacy increasingly important. Hansen's work depends on revealing what other people believe they could keep hidden. But as his fame grows, his own privacy becomes increasingly valuable and increasingly difficult to protect. The public wants to know more. The media wants more information. And the television industry wants to keep the audience interested. At some point, the person behind the investigation becomes an investigation himself. That is the direction the story appears to be moving toward. The success that Hansen once wanted has become something he has to manage. And managing success can be harder than achieving it. Because when you are unknown, you only have to prove yourself. When you become famous, you have to constantly prove that you deserve the fame. Hansen has reached that second stage. The cameras are everywhere. The expectations are growing. And the people around him are beginning to realize that whatever happens next will not simply affect one episode. It could change the entire future of the program. And once that possibility becomes real, even the most confident person in the room has to start wondering whether the machine he helped build is still under his control. The feeling that the machine is becoming bigger than Hansen himself continues to grow. And this is where the story can start moving from professional pressure into something much more personal. For years, Hansen has been the person asking difficult questions, controlling the conversation, and deciding when the camera should focus on someone else. Now, for the first time, he is beginning to understand what it feels like when the attention turns back toward him. That shift changes the atmosphere around him. The same public that once celebrated the investigations can become unpredictable when its expectations change. People who admire Hansen want him to continue being the confident figure they recognize. Critics want to examine his methods. Television executives want to protect the value of the program. And the people working closest to him have to decide whether they should continue supporting every decision or start questioning where the operation is heading. None of this happens all at once. The pressure builds slowly. A conversation that once would have been easy suddenly becomes uncomfortable. A decision that once seemed obvious now requires several people to discuss it. Hansen starts receiving more questions than answers, and that can be difficult for someone who has built his career around being the person with the answers. This is where his character becomes more complicated. He isn't suddenly losing his confidence. If anything, he may become even more determined. But determination can sometimes look very similar to stubbornness when someone is under pressure. Hansen knows what he wants to achieve, and because he believes the mission is important, he may feel justified in continuing even when people around him begin raising concerns. That creates a difficult emotional situation for everyone involved. If someone challenges Hansen, are they challenging his methods or the mission itself? If they ask him to slow down, are they protecting the investigation or weakening it? If they question the television format, are they concerned about ethics or simply afraid of losing the audience? These questions don't have obvious answers, and that's exactly what makes the conflict believable. The production team is also dealing with a strange reality. They are working on investigations that involve serious behavior, but their workplace increasingly resembles a successful entertainment production. There are cameras everywhere, schedules to maintain, people discussing footage, and decisions being made about what will eventually appear on television. The contrast can be unsettling. A serious investigation is happening inside an environment where television has its own rules. The people behind the cameras have to remember both realities at the same time. They are journalists, they are television producers, they are employees, and they are also people who can become emotionally affected by what they see. That last part is easy for the audience to forget. When viewers watch an investigation from home, they can turn off the television afterward. The people who created the investigation don't always have that luxury. They spend days researching it, preparing for it, recording it, reviewing the footage, and discussing what happened. The story can stay with them. Hansen, more than anyone, has to carry that weight. He becomes the face of the program, which means he also becomes the person audiences associate with every investigation. When people praise the show, they praise him. When people criticize it, they criticize him. That level of responsibility can create an enormous emotional burden. And yet, Hansen continues, part of the reason is obvious. He believes the work matters. But there may be another reason as well. The work has become his identity. Once a career becomes deeply connected to someone's sense of purpose, stepping away can feel almost impossible. Even if the person recognizes that the situation is becoming unhealthy, they may continue because they don't know who they would be without the work. That makes Hansen's journey much more human. He's not simply chasing ratings. He's chasing meaning. The problem is that television has attached meaning to success. The bigger the audience, the more important the work feels. The more people talk about the investigations, the more Hansen feels that what he is doing matters. And that can create a dangerous assumption that attention automatically equals impact. But those two things aren't always the same. A story can attract millions of viewers without changing anything. A smaller investigation can have enormous impact without becoming famous. Television encourages people to measure success through numbers. Journalism often has to measure success through consequences. Hansen is stuck between those two definitions. This tension becomes especially interesting when we look at the audience. The viewers watching at home may believe they are supporting Hansen because they care about the issue, but their attention also creates the commercial value that keeps the program alive. That means the audience is simultaneously supporting the journalism and supporting the entertainment business surrounding it. There is no way to completely separate those things. And perhaps the movie's greatest strength is that it doesn't pretend they can be separated. Instead, it shows how one naturally becomes connected to the other. A powerful investigation attracts viewers. Viewers create ratings. Ratings create network support. Network support allows more investigations. More investigations create more attention, and more attention makes Hansen even more famous. The cycle keeps repeating, but eventually, every cycle reaches a point where something has to change. Hansen's growing fame also changes the way people interact with him. Strangers recognize him. People have opinions about him before meeting him. His professional reputation enters rooms before he does. That can be useful for someone who works in television, but it can also make normal relationships difficult. People may treat Hansen differently because of his fame. Some may want to work with him because of his reputation. Others may distrust him for exactly the same reason. And some may simply be fascinated by the person behind the television personality. The more famous he becomes, the harder it is to know who is reacting to Hansen and who is reacting to the image of Hansen. That distinction becomes increasingly important because the public image isn't entirely under his control. Television creates a version of him. The network promotes that version. The audience interprets that version. And eventually, the version becomes so familiar that people forget it is only part of the real person. Robert Pattinson's performance can make that contrast especially powerful because he doesn't play Hansen like a traditional larger-than-life hero. There is something controlled and slightly distant about the character. He seems comfortable when the camera is focused on someone else, but the moments when attention turns toward him feel different. The man who is used to controlling the room suddenly has to respond. That creates vulnerability without requiring the character to become weak. Hansen can remain confident while still being uncertain. He can believe in his mission while questioning some of the consequences. He can enjoy his success while fearing what that success might eventually cost. Those contradictions make him feel like a real person rather than a simple movie character. Meanwhile, the television operation continues moving forward. There is always another investigation, another meeting. Another decision. Another deadline. The machine doesn't stop just because one person is tired. That's another reason Hansen cannot easily step away. The program now depends on the momentum of everyone involved. If Hansen slows down, other people are affected. If the network loses confidence, careers are affected. If the audience loses interest, the entire operation could change. He is carrying more than his own career. He is carrying the expectations of everyone around him. And that makes every decision heavier. As the pressure increases, the story begins approaching a point where Hansen will have to make choices that cannot simply be undone later. The television success has created opportunities, but it has also created consequences. The audience can sense that something is coming, not necessarily because a villain is preparing a final attack, but because the system itself is becoming unstable. Too many expectations. Too many competing interests. Too much attention. Too much pressure. And one person standing at the center of it all. Hansen spent years trying to expose what other people wanted to hide. Now, he has reached a point where the world is becoming interested in what he wants to hide from them. And once that happens, the rules of the investigation begin to change, because the investigator is no longer standing outside the story. He is becoming the story. Standing outside the story. He is becoming the story. Once Hansen becomes part of the story, the atmosphere around the investigation changes completely. Until now, he has been able to stand on one side of the camera and examine what other people are doing. But the moment his own choices, reputation, and motivations become subjects of discussion, that distance disappears. He can no longer assume that the public will only focus on the people he investigates. They are beginning to look at the person conducting the investigation as well. That creates a different kind of pressure, because Hansen is used to controlling the questions. Now other people are asking them, why does he continue doing this work? How much does the mission matter compared with the television success? Does he still see himself primarily as a journalist? And perhaps the most uncomfortable question of all, has the attention changed him? Hansen may not have an immediate answer to any of these questions. From his perspective, the purpose of the investigations remains important. He can point to the people who might otherwise remain hidden, the information that needs to be exposed, and the audience that now has a better understanding of the problem. Those are powerful reasons to continue, but the people around him can see another reality. The show has become a business. Hansen has become a recognizable personality, and the audience has developed an appetite for the kind of confrontation the program provides. That doesn't automatically make the work meaningless. It simply makes the situation more complicated. This is where the story can slow down and spend more time with Hansen as a person. Away from the studio lights, there is a man who has to live with the consequences of being publicly recognized. The confidence he displays on television doesn't necessarily disappear, but it becomes harder to maintain when he isn't standing in front of an audience. There is a difference between being confident because you know what you're doing and being confident because everyone expects you to know what you're doing. Hansen is increasingly experiencing the second kind of pressure. People look toward him whenever something goes wrong. They expect him to make the decision. They expect him to know what comes next. They expect him to remain calm. That expectation can become exhausting. And because Hansen has built such a strong public image, admitting uncertainty could feel dangerous. If the audience sees doubt, they may question his authority. If the network sees hesitation, they may question his ability to lead. If his colleagues see uncertainty, they may wonder whether the entire operation is beginning to lose direction. So Hansen does what he has always done. He keeps moving. Another investigation begins. Another set of preparations takes place. Another group of people starts working behind the scenes. The familiar routine returns, and for a moment it almost feels like everything is normal again. But it is in single quotes t. The previous pressure hasn't disappeared. It has simply been carried into the next investigation. That is one of the most realistic aspects of the story. Problems don't always arrive as one huge event. Sometimes they follow you quietly from one project to another. The same unresolved questions remain in the background while everyone becomes busy with the next deadline. The production team knows this. They have already seen how quickly a successful investigation can turn into a major television event. Now, they understand that every new investigation carries the same potential for success and the same potential for trouble. That creates a strange mixture of excitement and fear. When the next operation begins, everyone wants it to work. They want the information to be accurate. They want the investigation to succeed. They want the program to deliver. But at the same time, they know exactly what can happen if things go wrong. This time, there is much more at stake. Hansen's reputation has grown. The network's investment has grown. The audience has grown. The expectations have grown. A mistake that might once have been treated as an unfortunate incident could now become a major public controversy. That possibility is always present, and it changes the way the team works. People become more careful. Conversations become more serious. Every detail receives additional attention. Even simple decisions can require long discussions because everyone understands the potential consequences. For Hansen, this can feel frustrating. He wants action. He wants results. He knows that too much hesitation can weaken an investigation. But the people around him are increasingly aware that speed isn't always the same thing as progress. Sometimes waiting is necessary. Sometimes checking one more detail can prevent a much larger problem. Sometimes the most professional decision is the one that makes the television program less exciting. That conflict between urgency and caution becomes one of the central tensions inside the team. Hansen naturally leans toward action because his entire television identity has been built around confronting problems directly. But the people responsible for research, production, and legal protection may see risks that he doesn't immediately notice. This doesn't make Hansen careless. It makes him human. He has a particular way of approaching problems, and that approach has helped him become successful. The difficulty is that the same qualities that made him successful can become weaknesses when the situation changes. Confidence can become stubbornness. Determination can become impatience. Ambition can become obsession, and the line between them isn't always obvious while you're living through it. The movie can explore those differences without making Hansen suddenly behave like a completely different person. Instead, small changes reveal that the pressure is affecting him. He listens differently. He reacts differently. He becomes more protective of the program. And when someone questions the direction of the investigation, he takes it more personally than he once did. That is because the program is no longer simply his work. It has become his legacy. He has spent so much time building it that criticism of the program can feel like criticism of everything he has accomplished. The people around him may not understand that immediately. They may believe they are simply raising legitimate concerns. Hansen may hear something else. He may hear doubt, and doubt is dangerous when an entire operation depends on confidence. The audience also begins seeing the consequences of Hansen's growing fame. His face is now familiar enough that people can recognize him outside the television environment. That can create moments where the boundary between his professional and personal life becomes blurred. A person who once walked through the world without being noticed now has to think about how other people see him. That may sound like a small change, but it can completely alter someone's behavior. You become more aware of what you say, more aware of who is watching, more aware of how quickly a private moment can become public. Hansen's entire career is built around observation, yet he is becoming increasingly aware that he is being observed too. That irony continues to follow him. The investigator has become the subject. The person behind the camera is now in front of it. And the more the public wants to understand Hansen, the less space he has to remain simply a journalist. This also affects the way the audience interprets his actions. A decision that might once have looked professional can now be interpreted as a publicity move. A confident statement can be viewed as arrogance. A mistake can be seen as evidence that the entire operation is flawed. Once a public image becomes established, people rarely judge actions in isolation. They judge them through the image they already have. Hansen has become famous enough for that image to matter. And that means every new investigation carries another layer of risk. The team isn't simply trying to uncover information anymore. They are trying to protect the credibility of the entire operation while continuing to produce television that people actually want to watch. Those goals can work together, but they can also collide. And as the next investigation begins taking shape, Hansen is forced to confront a reality he may have been avoiding for some time. He cannot control everything. He cannot control how the audience reacts. He cannot control how the network interprets the results. He cannot control what critics say, and he certainly cannot control how history will eventually judge his choices. All he can control is what he does next, for someone who has built his career around controlling the television moment. Accepting that limitation may be one of the hardest challenges he has faced. The cameras are ready, the team is waiting, the audience is expecting another major story, and Hansen steps forward once again, but this time, the pressure isn't only coming from the investigation in front of him. It's coming from everything behind him. Every success. Every expectation. Every decision. Every compromise. All of it has followed him into this moment. And as the next chapter begins, Hansen has to decide whether he is still chasing the mission he started with, or whether the machine surrounding that mission has quietly become the thing he is fighting to protect. The next stage of Hansen's journey becomes even more complicated because the investigation is no longer taking place in a vacuum. Every new decision carries the weight of everything that happened before it. The team has experience now, the network understands the value of the program, and the audience already knows what kind of television event to expect. On paper, that should make the process easier. In reality, it makes everything more difficult because there is now far more to lose. Hansen walks into the next phase with the confidence of someone who has already proven himself, but that confidence is accompanied by an awareness that people are watching him more closely than ever. He can't simply focus on the investigation anymore. He has to think about how the investigation will be received, how the network will respond, and how his own reputation will be affected by whatever happens next. That creates an unusual situation, where the pressure begins before anything has even happened. The team starts preparing carefully, information is reviewed, plans are discussed, and everyone knows that the smallest detail could become important later. The atmosphere isn't necessarily chaotic. In fact, it can feel almost too controlled. Everyone understands that they are dealing with something serious, and nobody wants to be responsible for a mistake. Hansen, however, remains focused on the objective. He wants to move forward. He wants the investigation to produce results, and he believes that hesitation could give the other side an opportunity to disappear. This difference in perspective creates friction inside the team. Some people see patience as necessary. Hansen sees it as a potential risk. Neither side is completely wrong, but their priorities are becoming increasingly difficult to reconcile. The longer the team prepares, the more everyone becomes aware of how much the program has changed. Early investigations may have felt like experiments. Now there is a formula, a structure, and an audience waiting for the next chapter. That familiarity creates confidence. It also creates danger. When people become comfortable with the process, they can start assuming that previous success guarantees future success. But every investigation is different. Every situation contains variables that cannot be predicted. Hansen knows that. Still, experience can create its own kind of blindness. You start believing you understand the environment because you've worked in it before. You know how people react. You know how cameras behave. You know how the production works. You know how the network thinks. But the moment something unexpected happens, that confidence can be tested. And the story begins moving toward one of those moments. The investigation itself becomes more intense, but the film doesn't need to rush through it. Instead, the tension comes from the knowledge that everyone involved is trying to maintain control. The team has a plan, and they are relying on that plan to keep the situation safe and organized. Hansen remains calm because that is what he does. He has learned how to walk into uncomfortable situations without showing fear. His television experience allows him to maintain a steady presence even when the person across from him becomes emotional or defensive. But this time, there is another layer. Hansen isn't only thinking about what is happening in front of him, he is thinking about the cameras, the production. The audience, the network. His reputation. All of those things exist in the back of his mind. That makes his position much more complicated than it was at the beginning of his career. The man who once had one clear objective now has several competing objectives. Expose the truth, protect the investigation, protect the team, protect the program, protect his reputation, and somehow keep the audience interested. Those goals are not always compatible. The people around Hansen begin feeling that pressure too. Some may admire his determination, while others are beginning to wonder whether he is pushing too hard. When someone becomes the public face of a successful operation, people can become hesitant to challenge them. That hesitation can create problems. A team works best when people can question decisions freely, but fame can change workplace relationships. The person at the center of the operation has more influence, and that influence can make disagreement uncomfortable. Hansen may not even realize it is happening. From his perspective, he is simply trying to get the job done, but from the perspective of someone working beside him, challenging Hansen may feel like challenging the entire system. This is another subtle way the movie can show how success changes people without turning anyone into a cartoon villain. The system itself changes behavior. People become more cautious. They choose their words carefully. They think about consequences before speaking. And sometimes they remain silent when they should speak. That silence can become dangerous. Meanwhile, the audience remains unaware of most of what is happening behind the scenes. Viewers see the final broadcast, not the arguments, uncertainty, or anxiety that existed before it. They see Hansen confidently presenting the investigation, and that image reinforces the idea that everything happened exactly as planned. But the reality is much messier. That contrast is central to the movie's style. The polished television product hides the complicated process that created it, and the more successful the program becomes, the more polished that product has to be. This creates a strange form of pressure on Hansen. He has to perform confidence even when the people around him are uncertain. He can't walk onto television and tell millions of viewers that the production team is nervous. He can't show every disagreement. He can't reveal every uncertainty. He has to present a clear story. That is part of his job, but it also means that the public version of Hansen is becoming increasingly different from the private reality. The audience sees certainty. The team sees uncertainty. The audience sees a successful investigation. The team sees all the things that could have gone wrong. The audience sees a television personality. The people closest to Hansen see a man carrying enormous pressure. That difference makes his character more sympathetic without requiring the movie to excuse every decision he makes. Hansen isn't perfect. He doesn't always know the right answer. He can become too focused on the mission. He can underestimate the emotional consequences of his work. And he can become defensive when people question him. But those weaknesses are exactly what make him interesting. The movie isn't asking us to decide whether Hansen is good or bad. It is asking us to understand what happens when a person with a strong sense of purpose becomes incredibly successful inside an industry that rewards attention. Success amplifies everything. It amplifies strengths. It amplifies weaknesses. It amplifies mistakes. And it amplifies consequences. Hansen's confidence makes him effective, but that same confidence can make him resistant to criticism. His ambition pushes the investigation forward, but that ambition can also make it difficult for him to stop. His ability to control the television moment creates powerful broadcasts, but it also makes him increasingly aware of the importance of maintaining the image he has created. All of these qualities exist at the same time, and as the new investigation approaches its critical moment, Hansen is forced to rely on the team around him more than ever. That may be difficult for him, because trusting other people means accepting that you cannot control everything. For someone who has spent his career controlling the conversation, that can feel uncomfortable. But there are moments when control has to be shared. The investigation moves forward. The cameras are positioned. The team is ready. The plan is in motion. And Hansen steps into the situation knowing that this moment could define the future of the program. Not because it is necessarily the biggest investigation yet, but because the world around him has changed. The audience is bigger. The expectations are higher. The network is more invested. And Hansen himself has become a much more visible figure. There is no going back to the way things were. Whatever happens next will be seen through everything that came before it. And for the first time, Hansen has to consider something he may not have wanted to admit. The investigation isn't just testing the people on the other side of the camera. It is testing him too. Because when you've built your entire career around exposing the truth, eventually the hardest question is whether you're prepared to face the truth about yourself. The investigation now reaches a point where preparation gives way to reality, and that is always the moment when a carefully planned operation can begin changing in unexpected ways. Hansen and his team have spent so much time preparing that everyone knows what should happen, but nobody can guarantee what actually will happen once the situation begins. The cameras are ready, the people involved are in position, and the atmosphere carries the kind of tension that comes from knowing there is no easy way to pause once everything starts moving. Hansen remains focused, but the pressure is visible beneath his calm exterior. He understands that this isn't simply another assignment. The audience is waiting for the next major moment, the network has expectations, and the people working around him know that the results could have consequences far beyond one episode. Every decision now has the potential to affect the future of the program. The first moments of the operation appear controlled. Hansen follows the plan, the team watches carefully, and the production moves forward without immediately revealing how complicated things are about to become. That sense of control is important because it makes the tension stronger. When everything seems organized, even a small unexpected development can suddenly change the atmosphere, and that's exactly what begins to happen. Information that looked straightforward becomes more complicated. People react in ways that weren't fully anticipated. The team has to adjust without losing focus. What looked like a simple sequence of events becomes a situation where everyone has to think quickly. Hansen is comfortable in these moments. This is the environment where his experience matters most. He knows how to remain composed when someone becomes nervous. He knows how to ask questions without revealing everything he already knows. He understands that sometimes the strongest approach is simply to allow another person to keep talking. But the pressure behind the camera is very different. The production team has to make decisions almost instantly. They have to think about safety, evidence, timing, and the final broadcast at the same time. A mistake could affect not only the investigation but everyone connected to it. This is where the difference between Hansen and the people around him becomes especially clear. Hansen is focused on the confrontation. The production team is focused on everything surrounding it. Both perspectives are necessary. Without Hansen, the television moment may not happen. Without the team, the moment may not be captured, protected, or presented responsibly. The investigation therefore becomes a test of the entire operation rather than just one individual. As the confrontation develops, the emotional intensity increases. Hansen's calm delivery contrasts with the nervousness of the person on the other side. The audience can feel that something important is happening even before anyone says anything dramatic. That is one of the strengths of the format. The tension doesn't come from physical action. It comes from information. One question can change the entire conversation. One answer can reveal something unexpected. One reaction can tell the team that they have discovered something more serious than they originally thought. Hansen knows how to recognize those moments. He doesn't need to rush. He allows the conversation to develop. That patience is part of what made his television persona so recognizable. But while Hansen remains focused on the confrontation, the people behind the cameras are dealing with their own pressure. They know that once the footage exists, the decisions aren't finished. Someone will have to review it. Someone will have to determine what can be shown. Someone will have to consider the legal and ethical consequences. The confrontation is only the beginning of another process. This is an important distinction because television can make investigations look complete when the cameras stop recording. They aren't. The footage has to be examined. Facts have to be confirmed. Context has to be considered. And eventually, someone has to decide how the audience should see what happened. That responsibility is enormous. Hansen may be the face of the operation, but he isn't the only person shaping the final story. As the investigation reaches its most intense moments, Hansen's control becomes almost theatrical. His ability to remain calm creates a powerful contrast with the situation around him. He knows the person in front of him is under pressure, and he understands how to use that pressure to reveal information. But there is also something else happening. Hansen is aware that this moment could become television history. That's the complicated part. He isn't simply experiencing the confrontation. He knows it is being recorded. He knows people will eventually watch it. He knows the network is going to care about how powerful the footage is. And somewhere in the back of his mind, he knows that his own reputation is connected to what happens next. That awareness creates a strange mixture of journalism and performance. The situation is real. The consequences are real. But the moment is also being captured for an audience. The movie doesn't need to tell us exactly what to think about that contradiction. It simply lets us experience it. And as the confrontation progresses, the boundaries between the investigation and the television program become increasingly difficult to separate. Hansen is doing journalism. He is also creating television. Both things are happening simultaneously. That is the central conflict at the heart of the story. Once the confrontation is over, there is no dramatic sense of everything being finished. Instead, the atmosphere shifts toward uncertainty. The people involved know that the difficult part may actually be beginning. What will happen to the footage? How will the network respond? Will the audience understand the context? Will critics question the methods? Will the investigation produce the impact Hansen hoped for? And what will the people involved do once the cameras are gone? These questions remain hanging in the air. Hansen has achieved the moment he wanted, but achieving the moment doesn't mean controlling everything that comes afterward. That is something he has been slowly learning throughout the story. You can control the questions, you can control the camera, you can control your performance, but you cannot completely control the consequences. And the consequences are now moving beyond Hansen's reach. The team begins reviewing what happened, and the mood is different from the excitement that existed before the investigation. There is satisfaction because the operation produced results, but there is also caution. Everyone understands that the footage is powerful, and powerful footage can create powerful reactions. Hansen may see the result as proof that the work is succeeding. Others may see it as a reason to slow down and think carefully. That difference once again creates tension. The network, meanwhile, has a completely different concern. They are thinking about the audience. How will viewers respond? Will the story generate attention? Will people talk about it? Will the program receive the ratings everyone expects? Those questions aren't necessarily malicious. They're simply part of the television business. But to Hansen and his team, they can feel uncomfortable because the investigation is about real people. This is the moment when the movie's central conflict becomes impossible to ignore. A serious investigation has produced compelling television. The question is whether the television success strengthens the mission or begins replacing it. Hansen believes the attention can help. If millions of people watch, then millions of people become aware of the problem. But awareness isn't the only measure. The way that awareness is created matters too. And the people around Hansen are beginning to understand that the future of the program will depend on how carefully they navigate that line. The investigation may be over for the moment, but the consequences are only beginning. Hansen returns from the confrontation with the same confident presence the audience has come to expect. Yet something has changed. He has seen how powerful the operation has become. He has seen how quickly a real situation can become a television event. And he has seen how many people now depend on that event being successful. The machine is no longer something he can simply step away from. It has momentum. And momentum has a way of carrying people forward even when they aren't completely sure where they are going. For Hansen, the next challenge won't be finding another investigation. There will always be another story. The harder challenge will be deciding what kind of story the program should become. Because after everything that has happened, one thing is clear. The cameras may have stopped recording, but the real consequences have just begun.